Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our guest today is Casey Plett. Casey Plett is the author of A Dream of a Woman, Little Fish, and A Safe Girl to Love, the co-editor of Meanwhile, Elsewhere, Science Fiction and Fantasy from Transgender Writers, and the publisher of Little Puss Press. She's written for the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, Sweeney's Internet Tendency, Winnipeg Free Press, and other publications. A winner of the Amazon First Novel Award and the Firecracker Award for Fiction, and a two-time winner of the Lambda Literary Award. Her work has also been nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and she's also served as the head of the jury for that prize as well. On Community is the latest in the Field Notes series published by Biblioasis and was released in 2023. Welcome, Casey.
Hello, it's good to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. You're an award-winning fiction writer, and this is a new foray into nonfiction, although I know you've written a lot of nonfiction. Did you write this concurrently with other work, or did you have to find a different approach to writing this way?
I definitely didn't write this concurrently with anything else. There were some things that were similar. The kind of like brainstorming part of things, like kind of like jotting stuff down that was eventually going to kind of cohere and like having fragments and that sort of thing. But of course, being nonfiction, there was something really different as well, which is that I felt I had to be more careful about what I was writing. I think when I wrote fiction, I felt very much more like I felt a little free to be a little messier. I feel a little free to be like, it's okay if I don't get this. It's okay if like no one else gets this. Whereas nonfiction, I was like, oh, I really got to make sure that like I'm saying something that I believe is true, that I can sort of like take to the pearly gates and be like, yes, I believe this. I think this is the correct way to look at things. Whereas in fiction, you just have to make sure the character is believed. That's true. You just have to make sure the character is what you're saying is true to them. So it sort of felt like a bigger lift in a lot of ways.
You draw on the opinions of various other writers for this work. Did you enjoy the research for this project? Is that something that you usually combine with your writing in different ways?
It's not something I usually combine now. And it was kind of fun, it gave me an excuse to read stuff that I've been wanting to read for a long time and never got around to. The one difficult thing was that I at some point had to go like, okay, I won't be able to get to this book. I won't be able to get to this book. Otherwise, I just will never finish it.
In On Community, the tone of writing is conversational, informal, and as mentioned, with very often personal insights. How did you and your editor, Dan Wells, come to this approach?
I always sort of knew it would be like that. I drew a lot of inspiration from other writers who had twin sort of personal essay memoir writing with a lot of sort of like deep research and social criticism. So two ones that immediately come to mind are Times Square Red, Times Square Blue by Samuel Delany, and then Harlem is Nowhere, A Journey to the Mecca of Black America by Sharifa Rhodes Pitts. Both of those books are very much like there's a lot of research involved, there's a lot of reading involved, but they're also, the authors themselves are so present in the text and the things that they're seeing, experiencing, and feeling are also so much there. And I think when I was younger, I might have thought like, when I read that kind of writing, I was like, oh, you gotta be, they probably had like researched something for decades and decades or something. And I think at some point I realized, oh, I can give a crack at this kind of thing too. I can give it a shot as well. So, yeah.
You draw on much of your own experience of community throughout this extended essay. As much as you'd like to share, why was it important to integrate that?
I'm not sure it would have felt true otherwise. I think I'm very interested in one of the most moving pieces of feedback I got to this draft of this book that a friend said, I found myself sort of stress testing your arguments against communities of my own, against communities that I live in. I tried to think like, well, is this true? And she's like, and I felt like it was. I would feel like um it would ring true for my own communities. So I tried really hard to every step along the way to be like, well, is this actually true for the communities that I live in? And I've moved around a lot of, I've sort of moved in and out, have moved in and out within a lot of different communities in my life. And I would think like, well, does this actually feel like, does it sort of pass the smell test? And there's lots of stuff I cut from the book actually that I would say didn't end up passing the smell test, which I would then eventually go like, I actually don't think this is right. I actually don't think this is universally true. I have to cut it. Um, so I always sort of knew that personal stuff would be involved there. Although I think a lot of my people who gave feedback and editors sort of pushed me to include more. Earlier drafts of this book there were a lot more like research heavy and a lot more like this guy says this and this guy says this. Um, and some people pushed me to add in more personal stuff where in sections where there weren't. So
In the short interlude section of the essay, you write, much is revealed when a community asks what it does not want to look at. You look at the positives and negatives of a community in many thoughtful ways. Why was that important to bring to our attention?
um, I'm glad you asked that. It's a big kernel of the book, honestly. I think that part of what drove me to start writing this book was thinking about how much I didn't want to think about community, about how much that the concept sort of like gave me the heebie-jeebies. Um, and I found myself being somewhat cynical or nihilistic about community, having seen how it can go wrong in so many ways, and having seen how it can like punish individuals, and there's groupthink, and there's shunning, and there's just like casting people out. Um, and so I would have felt very cynical about it. But still, of course, I mean, like we all have to live in communities. You kind of don't think I don't think you kind of get to opt out of that. And then in the first year of the pandemic, that became really, really apparent. Like I can't ignore this anymore. Like there's like obviously a part of my life and it's obviously necessary in some way. And so I felt like I wanted to unpick that knot. And so it always felt very important to me to talk about how community can be really bad and community can be really toxic and community can be really harmful and painful and like really cruel. But it's necessary anyway, and we can't give up on it. That's really honestly the driving sort of like um, dual reality I think that drove me to write this book. Like I know all the ways in which community can really, really mess a lot of stuff up, and yet I don't think we can give up on it.
You know that there's a difference between networking and community building. What is the difference, do you think, and how does that impact writers in particular?
Yeah, it's a good question. Someone told me once, I forget who, that like networking is transactional and community doesn't have to be. Um, so in networking, it's sort of like, oh, I'm doing this for this person because I know I'm going to get something else. I'm like literally entering into this interaction because I know that I'm going to have to make some sort of like trade of some kind for my benefit. Whereas community, I think it can be transactional. You can give things and get things, but in community, you enter into these things without necessarily um, those transactional expectations. So for writers, I think there's something really key where like, I think I've seen like writers go to events or uh, build relationships with kinds of people for networking purposes simply because like I want to get something from this person, which, is a little, I mean, it has to happen sometimes in life, but that doesn't feel particularly healthy. That doesn't feel particularly like the kind of life that I want to lead. Um, and I think there's something more to the idea of like, um, writers entering into those kinds of spaces or doing kinds of things out of an idea of community. Like I'm only doing this because I think it's kind of like the right thing to do, or because I think it's kind of like cool, we can do something together. And like maybe there'll be something that comes out of this that benefits me later on down the line. But if it doesn't, that's okay too. That's not why I'm doing this. So I forget who told me that. I wish I could remember who, but it was very big for me when someone made that articulation.
It's really good distinction. And I'd like to take that and also go back to something that you were also saying. There is a largely affectionate reference to other Mennonite writers, and you and they were even portrayed in the recent feature in the Globe and Mail as both insiders and outliers of the Mennonite community. Are outsiders seeking to find out what community means from those who had to leave a certain community? It's kind of ironic, no?
I suppose so. I think there's lots of people too who live within those communities who still somewhat feel like outsiders or don't. That's something that um, that Dan Wells actually asked me to think about a lot. The difference between the feeling of belonging, like, do I feel like I belong to a community or not? And then the actual actions of community, like, are people in my community taking care of me? Am I doing things for people in my community? That feeling of belonging and then the actual actions, those are kind of separate things. And they have a symbiosis and they can connect with each other, but sometimes they're different, you know? Um, but the Mennonite writer thing, um, I would sort of wonder if lots of writers who come from these kinds of specific communities are usually sort of by definition an outsider in a way because they're sort of observing things and they often leave and come back from their communities or they're exiled from their communities or they just like they have a certain sort of like lens on their community within the wider world. I think it's like a very just common thing for writers in particular, probably.
So, reading is such a personal activity, and yet, as you note, Casey, we are a reading public. What kind of public did you have in mind as you wrote this essay?
Yeah, gosh. I don't know. I think I guess you could say like all the communities that I'm part of, so that's fun. Um, Probably the biggest thing I thought of that, especially when I was writing about real people, um, who are like in my life or people who I've interacted with or people who I've had some sort of personal, I would start thinking, like, okay, like if they read this, would they think this is fair? They might not have the same lens on things that I do. They might not have the same conclusion, but like if they read this, would they feel um, put out or cheated or like kind of like alive it over some truths? So I think I was thinking of those people a lot, and I tried to kind of like hold that up as like a heuristic. Would they feel this is fair?
In one of the footnotes in the book, you have a very telling comment. You talk about how you are consistently intrigued how some attempts at building community alchemically catch fire and some never gather a spark. That's certainly a conundrum for anyone who's ever produced a literary event. Why do you think that is so challenging? What is the challenge that we all face?
Yeah, I don't know. I was definitely thinking of like my time throwing literary events when I wrote that for sure. And sometimes you can put like all your resources into stuff, and you're like, yeah, and like, okay, this is gonna be good, and we're gonna do it, and it's gonna okay, and like this is all coming together. And then, four people show up and are bored and leave, and you're like, okay, well, maybe not. And then something's like, whatever, this will be a tiny thing, like not gonna put that much work onto it. And then something like some sort of like beautiful serendipity happens. Um, and I don't know if I have an answer, I do think there's probably an element of serendipity and chaos where like there maybe isn't an answer. Um, but yeah, I would welcome thoughts. Anyone has the answer, email me.
We don't have the answers either. I wish we did. Oh my goodness. You note that in any community, but in particular the queer and trans communities, there is a danger in writing what we need to write. So, how do we keep on writing what we need to write, as you say, and still find a safe space, do you think?
I think I've always been at the idea that writing what you need to write kind of comes first, with the stipulation that writing isn't publishing. You can write something and then think like, okay, like what do I want to do with this? And then like, oh, okay, maybe it's a different idea, maybe a different goal. I think there's lots of honor in writing something and then putting it in a drawer for a decade. I think that's fine. Um, I always tell my students this too, like no one's ever gonna make you publish anything. No one's ever gonna like drag something off of your computer and be like, hack into your passwords and like, like, here, sorry, it's public now. Um, so I think there's something about obeying that need above all else. But again, writing isn't publishing, and they can be two separate sort of like decisions.
You also talk about community involving compassion, which is not finite, as you say.
Yeah.
and yet later mentioned that community building is awkward and not exactly sexy. So how do you think that also translates to the writing life?
There's like, I think, because of how much the word community is loaded with sort of like panacea, like, oh, this will fix everything. Community is everything, and it's like it's sold to us, and it's this buzzword, and you see it in corporations trying to sell us things, and you see it in like community organizing and like social justice and political things trying to like, oh, this community, like we're doing this for the community, or like this is for community, we're doing this for, like it's used so often. And so I think that there is a lot of times our expectations are dashed because it turns out that like a lot of good community building like is boring or awkward or like, yeah, like not exactly sexy. It's like very sort of like plain, and it's very workman like, perhaps, if I can use that word. And so I think that like there's like a tempering of expectations, grounded in some sort of more like mundane reality to think about with community.
So, what are you writing now? What are you working on?
Not nonfiction. I'm done with true things for a while. No more opinions. I don't want to have opinions for a while. Down with opinions. I have a novel that I'm trying to poke at, so we'll see.
Well, before you totally give up on opinions, would you like to read some of your work for us?
Sure, yeah, sure thing. I'll read a chapter on compassion.
Thank you.
Yeah. Morgan M. Page once said, "Pay attention when people invite you to turn off your compassion. It happens all the time, but compassion isn't actually a finite resource." And I think about that all the time. Money is a finite resource. Time is a finite resource. Emotional energy, which is different from compassion, is definitely a finite resource. But compassion? No, Morgan's right. I used to hear in my circles, in the wake of someone being a shitty human, that person is garbage. I wouldn't piss on him if he was on fire. Usually the person in question had done something shitty, indeed, but rarely had this person done something so egregious as to warrant synonymity with literal trash. Yet I would hear this often, and sometimes I happily returned to the shit talking. When I did, I could see a fire grow with fuel, like, say, I did that night in high school when after a night I started complaining, I pulled up my keyboard and wrote to my friend A. To withhold compassion, especially on a community level, even when it seems as if there's plenty of reason, it's amazing how easy it is to do. Pay attention when you're asked to do it. The idea of compassion as not being finite has helped me immensely. The key thing to unpick here, I think, is the difference between emotional energy and compassion. Emotional energy involves things you can't do forever or for just anyone, even if you'd like to. E.g., you can talk for hours with a friend going through a hard time, but can you do it deep into the night or with multiple friends every day or after coming home from a chaotic day at work or when a stranger accosts you in the bar or the train? Sometimes, sure. Pervasively? Unlikely. Anyway, the questions of emotional energy, it's all the stuff of the hard questions of being a decent, stable human. Compassion's a little different, though. I'm not sure you can run out of it in that way. I think it might be counterproductive to hoard it. When I encountered Morgan's words here, I was living in Windsor and I was often angry at a certain housemate. I was also often angry at my ex-girlfriend with whom that years-long breakup took place. I was also angry at the literary industry I was working in, whose values did not always line up with mine. And I was angry at certain Mennonites who were clinging to transphobia in a manner that affected my personal life. I had good reason to be angry in all these cases, and I did not owe everyone in the equations my emotional energy or my time. But it didn't do anything for me, in the most literal manner, to not have compassion. It didn't cost me my dignity or self-respect to extend compassion, the way it might have, say, to extend emotional energy or time. Opening myself to compassion while maintaining boundaries in such cases actually helped me unstick myself from cycles of anger and move on. I'll end there.
Casey Plett, thank you for being part of our community and sharing these wonderful thoughts with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, Sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.